All right. Hope everyone is well. As you can see, I am experimenting with a new setup here and just read. So I'm going to read the first chapter from Hidden Hand Exposing How the Chinese Communist Party is Restructuring the World. I read went over the table of contents and the preface last time. I just read this chapter maybe an hour ago, and the recording did not work. But I think I have fixed the microphone issue. So I'm going to read the first chapter here for you guys, an overview of the CCP's ambitions. And as you can see, I'm also experimenting with virtual backgrounds. It's exciting stuff here. So, all right, I'm going to read this. And please, guys, give me some feedback. If you guys like this material, I kind of cover different things, different topics on my channel. And also, if you guys would like to see some other types of content, live streaming, more analysis, more book reviews, and just kind of any feedback would be welcome. So I'm going to get started here. Oh, and definitely please like and subscribe and share. That helps out tremendously. So Chapter 1, an overview of the CCP's ambitions. The Chinese Communist Party is determined to transform the international order, to shape the world in its own image without a shot being fired. Rather than challenging from the outside, it has been eroding resistance from within by winning supporters, silencing critics, and subverting institutions. Whereas analysts on both sides of the Atlantic continue to agonize over whether to label China an opponent or even an enemy, the CCP decided this matter 30 years ago. In the post-Soviet world, it saw itself surrounded by enemies that it needed to defeat or neutralize. While the CCP and its supporters in the West like to speak of a quote-unquote new Cold War being waged against China, the party itself has all along been engaged in an ideological struggle against the hostile forces, quote-unquote hostile forces. For the CCP, the Cold War never ended. The reshaping of alliances and the remolding of the way the world thinks about it are essential to the party securing continued rule at home, as well as to its reach and eventually making China the #1 global power. The party's plans have been explained at length in speeches and documents. Its implementation strategy is to target elites in the West so that they either welcome China's dominance or accede to its inevitability, rendering resistance futile. In some nations, mobilizing the wealth and political influence of the Chinese diaspora, while at the same time silencing critics within it, is central to the strategy. Backed by its enormous economic clout, China engages in arm-twisting diplomatic pressure, united front, and quote-unquote friendship work, and the manipulation of media, think tanks, and universities. All these tactics overlap and reinforce each other. Some people claim that Beijing's influence around the world is no different to that of any other country. While not everything the party does in this respect is unique, the scope, degree of organization, and eagerness to use coercion distinguish the CCP's actions from other nations' diplomatic activities. As the world's largest factory and second biggest economy, China has been a magnet for Western businesses and many Western politicians. Some industries are heavily dependent on access to China's huge market, and Beijing is willing to use this dependence as a political weapon. In the words of one close observer, quote, "If you don't do what Beijing's political leaders want, they will punish you economically. They put the economic vice on politicians around the world. They have been doing it for years, and it works." At times, the vice has been tightened in conspicuous ways. After the arrest of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou in Canada in 2018, for example, imports of Canadian soybeans, canola, and pork were blocked. Beijing reacted in a similar way in 2017 when South Korea, in response to aggression from the North, began installing an American anti-ballistic missile system. Beijing took 43 retaliatory measures, including banning Chinese tourist groups to South Korea, driving a large Korean conglomerate out of China, barring K-pop stars, and blocking imports of electronics and cosmetics. Beijing was still punishing South Koreans in October 2019 when it demanded that the prestigious Eastman School of Music at the University of Rochester in New York State exclude 3 Korean students from its top orchestra if it wanted a planned tour of China to go ahead. Citing the damage to Eastman's reputation in China if the tour were to be canceled, the dean agreed to leave the Koreans behind. Only after an outcry by students and alumni did the school decide to cancel the tour. When Daryl Morey, general manager of the Houston Rockets basketball team, tweeted his support for Hong Kong protesters in late 2019, Beijing's backlash was instantaneous. The torrent of criticism on Twitter appears to have come from trolls and fake accounts in China. The televising of Rockets games to its huge fan base in China was suspended. Sponsors withdrew. Beijing raged that Mori had, quote, hurt the feelings of the Chinese people, end quote. The state broadcaster China Central Television redefined freedom of speech to exclude, quote, challenging national sovereignty and social stability, close quote. Desperate to protect its growing market in China, the U.S. National Basketball Association issued a fawning apology that read as if it were written by the CCP's Central Propaganda Department. While only a few examples of extreme punishment are needed in order to sow fear in everyone, Beijing prefers to keep its threats vague and thus deniable, to keep the targets guessing. As Perry Link puts it, vagueness frightens more people because no one can rule themselves out, and those in the frame therefore, quote, curtail a wider range of activity, close quote. Beijing has become the world's master practitioner of the dark arts of economic statecraft, in part because in recent decades, Western nations' commitment to free market policies make them reluctant to manipulate trade for political reasons. That's why the world was in shock when Donald Trump launched a trade war against China in 2018. While he is wrong on many other things, Trump is right that Beijing has been systematically violating the principles of international economic engagement and getting away with it. Beijing's vast program of infrastructure investment abroad, known as the Belt and Road Initiative, is the ultimate instrument of economic statecraft, or more accurately, economic blackmail. It provides an outlet for China's construction industry and enormous capital reserves, while at the same time supplying the investment needs for other countries who are short of capital and excluded from mainstream sources of finance. The offer of low-interest loans is hard to resist, especially when they come without environmental or other conditions. However, the objectives of the BRI, the Belt Road Initiative, also known as the New Silk Road, go well beyond providing an outlet for surplus Chinese capital or helping poorer nations develop. The initiative is Beijing's primary mechanism for reordering the global geopolitical system. Xi Jinping's signature policy is now so closely integrated with almost all Chinese government activity abroad, commercial, technological, academic, cultural, that it cannot be separated from the PRC's overall diplomatic engagement. Xi Jinping has reportedly referred to the BRI as essential to his vision of constructing, quote, a community of common destiny for humankind, close quote. While the idea might sound good to Western ears, its aim is a Sinocentric world, that is, the one envisioned by the hawks elevated by Xi to the top of leadership positions. They view a China-led world order as an essential part of the, quote, great rejuvenation of the Chinese people, close quote. So the BRI is the most powerful vehicle by which Beijing is changing the post-war international order. In a revealing 2015 speech, defense strategist and retired PLA Major General Xiao Liang described the BRI purely as the vehicle for China to achieve dominance over the United States. It represents, he stated, China's new and irresistible form of globalization, the success of which will be measured by the renminbi displacing the dollar as the world currency, leaving the United States, quote unquote, hollowed out. While Chao is a pusher of boundaries, the geostrategic rationale of the BRI is also made plain elsewhere, such as the leaked minutes of a 2019 Chinese-Malaysian meeting on a BRI project, which noted that despite the project's quote unquote political nature, the public had to see it as market driven. The adjective most frequently attached to the BRI is quote unquote vast. And when China's top diplomat Yang Jiechi said in April 2019 that the BRI, quote, does not play little geopolitical games, end quote, he was speaking the truth. The former editor of the Far Eastern Economic Review, Nayan Shanda, describes the BRI as, quote, an overt expression of China's power ambitions in the 21st century, close quote. Like other so-called parallel institutions created by the Chinese government, such as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the BRI pretends to pose no challenge to countries' existing institutions, while incrementally realigning their interests and shifting the global balance of power. A key part of the CCP's thinking on global and regional power dynamics is the identification of a, quote, main contradiction and a main enemy to unite against, close quote. On a global scale, that enemy is the United States, which needs to be split from its allies and isolated. Brexit, dissension in the European Union, and the election of Donald Trump have created a strategic opportunity for Beijing to weaken the transatlantic alliance and further erode European unity. Long seen by the CCP as the largely irrelevant junior partner of the United States, Europe is now viewed as the great prize. By winning over Europe, the CCP hopes to convince the world that China is the, quote, champion of multilateralism, close quote, and a much-needed counterweight to U.S. hegemony and unilateralism. Beijing wants to mobilize European support for its initiatives in the developing world. Although we won't be covering this theme in this book, similar strategies of breaking up existing alliances play out in other parts of the world. Despite all the news stories about quote unquote debt diplomacy, global connectivity, and win-win cooperation, it's apparent that the BRI's goal of strategic rebalancing is to be achieved not only by the political clout that goes with infrastructure investment, but also by a subtle and multi-pronged program of global thought management. The BRI is about the projection of power through controlling the terms of the debate. We developed this argument in Chapter 6. It no longer makes sense to confine discussion of the BRI to business and economics because it sprouts everywhere, from the Silk Road network of think tanks, media agreements, and ties between cultural institutions to the establishment of sister cities and, quote, people-to-people exchanges, close quote, all of which are incorporated into BRI memoranda of understanding. Today, the CCP remains deeply anxious about, quote, ideological infiltration, close quote, by hostile forces bent on regime change in China. As a manual published by the Central Propaganda Department in 2006 explained, quote, when hostile forces want to bring disarray to a society and overthrow a political regime, they always start by opening a hole to creep through in the ideological field and by confusing people's thought. Close quote. This Cold War mentality is vital to an understanding of the CCP's international activities, which are first and foremost the global extension of the party's desire for regime security. In the face of this threat of ideological infiltration, the CCP decided that the best form of defense is attack. Thus, when its leaders talk of making the international order more, quote, democratic, open, and diverse, close quote, this is code for an order in which, quote, authoritarian systems and values have global status equal to liberal democratic ones, close quote, as Melanie Hart and Blaine Johnson express it. In April 2016, the Global Times, the party's pugnacious tabloid, gave its readers a glimpse into the mindset of the CCP when it justified the internet censoring Great Firewall as a temporary defensive tool that, quote, quelled Western intentions to penetrate China ideologically, close quote. That is to say, once the CCP has reshaped global opinion, once its values, political system, and policies have gained worldwide acceptance, the threat to the CCP of Western ideas will be overcome, and the Great Firewall may no longer be needed. The party believes it is now powerful enough to transform the global conversation. Beijing also seeks to ensure that the world community shunts Chinese dissidents and proponents of an independent Taiwan. It wants international support for the idea that the CCP is the sole party fit to rule China. It also craves recognition that its political and economic system is superior to Western democracy and the liberal capitalist economic order, and that the CCP ruled China, in contrast to the United States, is a responsible global actor working for the greater good of humankind. Some have argued that this attempt to export the party's ideology is bound to fail, but it's an argument that no longer holds, as we shall see. For others, Beijing's claim to be a responsible world power and its criticism of the United States is an, quote, irresponsible global rogue, end quote, have appeal in light of the evidence from the Snowden leaks, the calamitous invasion of Iraq, and Donald Trump's call for regime change in Venezuela, among other events. The irony of Trump is that he has been pushing back hard against China's economic power while at the same time playing into the CCP's hands by isolating the U.S. from its allies, making them more vulnerable to party interference. China's rising influence in Europe has been welcomed by those who distrust America, as well as by some Eurosceptics who view China as a counterweight to the European Union or Europe's larger, more powerful countries. Beyond these camps, others are questioning the effectiveness of democracy and expressing admiration for China's system of authoritarian government. Others, still including squads of Western journalists on all expense paid tours, are awed by China's high-speed growth, technological progress, forgetting that other countries grew just as fast during their economic catch-up phases, and ignoring the fact that it was the CCP itself that prevented China from progressing at all for several decades. While many in the West repeat the CCP's claim to have lifted 700 million people out of poverty, it is more accurate to say that for 3 decades after the founding of the PRC, the People's Republic of China, in 1949, the CCP kept hundreds of millions in poverty. And it was only when it granted basic freedoms to own property, to start a business, to change jobs, to move one's place of residence, that the Chinese people lifted themselves out of poverty. That is the end of the chapter. So thanks for listening.